I'd like to thank Professor Ayers for her presentation, and I think she did present a rather grim scenario. I'll try and elaborate and explain a little bit further. So again, my name is Tom Popik. I'm chairman of the Foundation for Resilient Societies. We're a non-governmental organization dedicated to the protection of North American critical infrastructure. So in my position, I quite often get people coming to me, and they're concerned about what might happen if we had a critical infrastructure failure here in North America. So I just want to start out by taking a quick survey of the audience, and I notice some younger faces out there that's very encouraging. If you personally are concerned about your safety and the safety of your family, if we were to have a wide area critical infrastructure failure, and you've thought about what you might do to prepare, raise your hand, please. Okay, so I think we have about half the audience who've raised their hand. So what I'm here in 15 minutes today to do is to engage you in some thought and a little bit of a conversation and some clear thinking about the realities of critical infrastructure protection and how important it is. So let's just engage in a thought experiment. If we didn't have a functioning electric grid for North America, that would be Canada and the United States, what would be the consequences for the population? So I did a little bit of research, and I know what the population of Canada and the United States is combined. It's about 350 million people. And I also looked up some academic research on how many Aboriginal people there were in North America around 1,500. And there's a range of academic estimates, but they go between about 2 million and about 10 million. So let's just use the upper estimate of 10 million. And that's the carrying capacity of North America with the natural environment, the buffalo in the Great Plains and that kind of thing. So we'll just put 10 million in the numerator and 350 million in the denominator, and that would be essentially the population that would be likely to survive long term without modern technology or without an agricultural economy. And so that's really how important it is to protect critical infrastructure, and especially the electric grid, which is the keystone infrastructure. So I'll very briefly go through 4 principal threats to the electric grid. We've talked about already cyber attacks, also physical attacks. I'll just tell a brief story about a physical attack we had on the Western Interconnection in San Jose, just south of San Francisco. This was in April of 2013. Unknown parties engaged in a very sophisticated attack against the transformers at the Metcalf substation. That attack very narrowly failed. Had it succeeded, there would have been potentially a catastrophic power outage in both San Francisco and Silicon Valley, which is the heart of the internet complex for really the world. So that would have been a very catastrophic attack. That a lot of people don't realize that Metcalf attack happened within only 13 hours of the Boston Marathon bombing. So people often don't make that connection. There are other wide area threats to the North American power grid. They also include solar storms, which Dr. Pry talked about, and also electromagnetic pulse, which can be both localized and produced by a nuclear weapon. So those threats, we might call them initiating events, but regardless of the initiating event, let's talk about some of the realities of what would happen if there were an event called a long-term outage. So there's actually an acronym for this. It's called an LTO. And so to understand a long-term outage, we have to understand something about diesel fuel. So diesel fuel doesn't have a long storage life. It grows mold. And as a result, people and companies don't like to store a lot of diesel fuel for backup diesel generators because the fuel will go stale and it will have to be replaced, and that's an expensive process. So for various elements of critical infrastructure, the amount of fuel for the backup diesel generators is relatively minimal. So for example, for a lot of the telecommunications infrastructure, the backup diesel fuel would be between 1 and 3 days. For more critical nodes or facilities in the electric grid, for example, the most critical control rooms, that backup diesel fuel may be as long as 10 days. For nuclear power plants, within the United States, the standard for backup diesel fuel is 7 days. There may be a different standard here in Canada. I hope it's more, but I wouldn't expect it would be significantly more. So we have to think about if we were to have a wide area power outage where there wouldn't be outside assistance available, how would the grid actually be restarted? It turns out that the commercial electric grid is dependent on commercial telecommunications. And so we have a bit of a chicken and the egg circumstance. In order to start the grid, the control rooms would need to communicate with generating facilities. That would be through the commercial telecommunications infrastructure, but if the diesel fuel is run out for that infrastructure and the telecommunications system doesn't have the commercial grid, you can see that we're in a very difficult situation. Now, it's fortunate that we haven't had wide area outages in North America that have extended much beyond 24 hours, and that's within the boundaries of the available diesel fuel. I would elaborate a little bit further and say that electric utilities have tried to think through some of these issues, and so in the United States, we have a very lawyered society. We like to think of things in legal issues, and so we have a legal solution to the problem of diesel fuel replenishment. It's called a service level agreement, right? And so there are promises among diesel fuel suppliers to resupply these critical nodes in telecommunication systems and in the electric grid. But oftentimes there's not a lot of operational capability behind these service level agreements. And we know this because my organization has actually done the research. We've called up diesel fuel suppliers, we've talked to people in the fuel yards and found out what kind of operational provisions they have. So it's very, very important to protect not only against these initiating events, but also to encourage private companies and the regulatory structure to very carefully think through this issue of a long-term outage and how to build resilience into the restart capability, especially with diesel fuel supply. One of the things that we have advocated is at the very beginning of a wide area outage for the proper authorities to dispatch tanker trucks with diesel fuel to the most critical control rooms and telecommunication nodes, and for those tanker trucks to be also accompanied by police forces or by the military to protect them while the grid is restarted. So again, what I've talked about is just briefly some threats to the grid, this issue of long-term outage, and then I'll now talk about how important it is to prevent or mitigate these initiating events. And the fortunate thing is that the initiating events that I talked about, cyber threats, physical, solar storms, electromagnetic pulse, they can be inexpensively mitigated in many ways. So for example, cyber threats, the communication for control rooms and substations is often through the public internet, and it would surprise people to know that there is no standard for those communications to be encrypted. So how much does it cost to encrypt critical electric grid communications. For serial communications, it's $1,000. The devices cost $500 on each end. For IP-based communications, it's about $20,000. The devices cost about $10,000 on each end. I'm very sorry to tell you that the U.S. Congress passed a law back in 2005 requiring protection of electric grid communications, and that law still in 2015 has not been implemented. So we really, and as a matter of fact, there's an open rulemaking at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we're advocating for that encryption right now. Moving on to physical threats, it's important to have appropriate protection for the most critical nodes or control rooms, and I'm sorry to say that physical protection is lacking. I won't go into all the details, but I've visited some of these facilities, and I think that if the people here were to also go out and visit some of these electric grid facilities, you would be shocked by the low level of protection. Why do we have such a low level of protection? Well, because in democracies, we're often we don't protect against things that haven't happened, and we're very much concerned about keeping the cost of electricity affordable. When we get to the issue of solar storms, we could protect all of North America against solar storms, the North American grid at least, for less than $1 billion. And so that's very, very cost effective. Unfortunately, it hasn't been done, and as a matter of fact, the electric utility industry is actively fighting this hardware protection right now. And then finally, the issue of electromagnetic pulse. That is a difficult issue. It would be expensive to protect all of the electric grid up to military standards, but we could protect the most critical facilities enough at least to provide a deterrent against foreign attackers. So just to wind up, I think I've talked about some threats to the electric grid, this issue of long-term outage and how we need to think through about how to make sure that we don't get in a long-term outage that can't be restarted, some of these very practical issues of fuel resupply. But where does this all come to? We can talk about it here, but in order for change to occur, we have to advocate in front of regulatory bodies and legislatures and elected leaders. In the United States, we have an independent commission called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. My group is very active in front of that commission. There's actually a parallel structure here in Ontario. It's the Ontario Energy Board, and so I would just encourage all of you in the audience to learn more about how electric grid reliability is regulated and engage in the process because Professor Ayers talked about some very grim scenarios, and I will say it's probably a good idea to store several days, weeks, or maybe even months of food and water and think through a plan. But ultimately, if North American societies are to survive, we need to protect the critical infrastructure, and that is probably the most effective way of protecting both yourself and your family members. So again, it's very important to become engaged in the regulatory process. So I'll thank you very much for your attention, and I know we have some breakout sessions and some questions later on. I'll look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.